You would think that if you were going to make a movie that cost tens or hundreds of millions of dollars, you would get all your ducks lined up in a row, right? You would know what you needed to shoot, where and when you needed to shoot it, and who you would be shooting with. Well, sometimes fate has other plans, and in this video, I want to talk about those plans. Specifically, I want to take a look at some last-minute casting decisions that gave us the classics that we have today. Some of these were actually beyond last minute, as in the movie was already filming or was even complete before an actor had to be totally replaced. Most shocking of all is that all of these movies were critical and commercial successes. The Lord of the Rings is, for my money, the most impressive filmmaking achievement of the last 30 years, even more so than James Cameron's Titanic. Peter Jackson was just in his mid-30s when he took on the undertaking. He, the cast and crew would spend years in New Zealand, first for principal photography and then for pickup shots. It resulted in 3 masterpieces and a well-deserved 11 out of 11 Academy Awards for Return of the King in 2004. People might forget now, but Return of the King was only the second movie ever to make more than $1 billion at the box office, just after James Cameron's Titanic, which also won 11 Academy Awards. It's wild to consider, then, that a pretty important part of it might have been different. Viggo Mortensen, who played Aragorn, was not the first choice. In fact, Mortensen wasn't even there on the first day of filming. Casting Aragorn took quite a while. Jackson cycled through a number of actors, including Vin Diesel, Nicolas Cage, Russell Crowe, and Daniel Day-Lewis. Lewis was actually Jackson's first choice, but apparently he kept turning it down. So, the role first went to Stuart Townsend. Townsend was in his mid-20s at the time and had started acting in the early 1990s. He had been in a few movies at that point, such as 1997's Shooting Fish and 2000's About Adam. He was, by all accounts, a rising star. Unfortunately, he was, in Jackson's eventual opinion, too young. He was too fresh-faced to be Aragorn. That said, there also could have been some behind-the-scenes issues at play, such as Townsend being difficult to work with. This is how Townsend described his firing. Quote, "I was there rehearsing and training for 2 months, then was fired the day before filming began. After that, I was told they wouldn't pay me because I was in breach of contract due to not having worked long enough. I had been having a rough time with them, so I was almost relieved to be leaving until they told me I wouldn't be paid. I have no good feelings for those people in charge, I really don't. The director wanted me and then apparently thought better of it because he really wanted someone 20 years older than me and completely different." End quote. Honestly, I think it's a bit of both. Jackson ran into a similar issue on The Lovely Bones, where he replaced Ryan Gosling with Mark Wahlberg because they couldn't communicate on what they wanted his character to be like, while Townsend would later be replaced as Fandral in Thor over quote-unquote creative differences. I could believe both of them sharing the blame for this. Whatever the case though, Viggo Mortensen was the right man for the job. I think Eddie Murphy is pretty inextricable inextricable from his role as Axel Foley in the Beverly Hills Cop series. I can't imagine anyone else in the role, though if it weren't for some last-minute changes, Sylvester Stallone, of all people, could have gotten the job. When I think of the 1980s, I think of one genre of film, action, and when I think of action, one of the first names that comes to mind is Sylvester Stallone. His rivalry with Arnold Schwarzenegger is, at least for some, legendary, as well as amusing, like the time that Schwarzenegger tricked Stallone into doing Stop or My Mom Will Shoot, but that's for another video. Legendary producer Don Simpson conceived of the idea for Beverly Hills Cop in the late 70s and had a screenwriter work on it, but it wouldn't be until the 80s, after Flashdance, that he started working on it in earnest. Daniel Petrie Jr. wrote the first script and worked in the comedy that we associate with the movie now. But when the role of Axel Foley was offered to Stallone, the actor also came down on the screenplay. We mostly think of Stallone as an actor, which makes sense because that's what he's always wanted to be. But lest we forget, the man also wrote Rocky in a 4-day writing frenzy and obviously has an eye for action. But when Stallone went to town on the movie, he apparently took out all of the funny and made it a dramatic action film like the ones he usually did. This is how Stallone described it, quote, "By the time I was done, it looked like the opening scene from Saving Private Ryan on the beaches of Normandy. Believe it or not, the finale was me in a stolen Lamborghini playing chicken with an oncoming freight train being driven by the ultra-slimy bad guy," end quote. However, neither Don Simpson nor producer-distributor Paramount were fans of that idea. They wanted the funny movie. A whirlwind soon ensued. With just 2 weeks to go until production started, Don Simpson and producing partner Jerry Bruckheimer convinced Eddie Murphy to replace Stallone. A 1984 New York Times article captured the mood pretty well, quote, "Catastrophe loomed. After 8 years of work, at least 6 scripts, a string of screenwriters, and an investment of $2 million, Paramount was back where it started. It had an idea that its executives loved, but that creative personnel seemed incapable of translating into a film, end quote. The shooting script wouldn't be finalized until the day that production started, with plenty of input from Eddie Murphy. In an interview around the time that Axel F came out on Netflix in 2024, Murphy said the following, quote, "The original Beverly Hills Cop script is not written funny. It was a Sylvester Stallone action movie. Then he went and did a movie called Cobra that was his Beverly Hills Cop. It's like, if you give me anything that any action star has, I'm not going to play it like Stallone, I'm not going to play it like Tom Cruise. I'm going to play it like me," end quote. That's exactly what he did, and it was exactly the right move. It's one thing to replace an actor when you're down to the wire. It's another to replace them when you've already started filming. But what if you've already made the movie and find yourself second-guessing your choice? That's what happened with Spike Jonze on 2013's Her, which starred Joaquin Phoenix and Scarlett Johansson. Johansson, who voiced the conversant AI Samantha, was not just a last-minute replacement, but an after-the-fact replacement. Samantha's voice was first provided by Samantha Morton, who, by that point, had already earned 2 Academy Award nominations, one for 1999's Sweet and Low Down, and the other for 2003's In America, and has a pretty impressive resume. They started filming in mid-2012, and Jonze was 6 months deep into post-production when he had the realization that Morton was not the voice that he wanted for Samantha. If Her was any other kind of film, and Samantha was any other kind of role, this could have been disastrous. It could have been the case that they needed to scrap what they had or delay the release of the movie. But there are 2 instances where a last-minute change can conceivably be made. The first is if it's a voice role, because there's no need to sit for makeup or block shots or wait to reset the camera. The other is if you're Ridley Scott, but we'll get to that a little later. Of the need to recast Morton, Jonze told Mark Harris, writing for Vulture, that quote, "We just couldn't get there. Making a movie like this in which a character only exists in her voice, in the reaction of a character on screen, and in the viewer's imagination, she had to exist just in the air. It's hard to know what's going to make that work. We didn't know until we got deep into post-production," end quote. A number of names were bandied about, but Jonze would eventually decide to go with Scarlett Johansson. It wasn't simply a redub. Jonze had to call back the cast and crew in order to reshoot some scenes, particularly the ones that featured Joaquin Phoenix. As Harris noted in the Vulture article, quote, "Too much of Phoenix's performance was calibrated to the rhythms of Morton's delivery to make a simple line-for-line substitution effective. Instead, he will spend the next several weeks rebuilding the scenes between Theodore and the OS in a number of different ways, turning Samantha into a character with more tempest and volatility, a mind of her own, or the illusion of one, than she had exhibited before," end quote. Johansson would play the role differently, in Harris's words, quote, "Whereas Morton could sound maternal, loving, vaguely British, and almost ghostly, Johansson plays the role as younger, more impassioned, and with more yearning," end quote. Jonze owned up to the beyond last-minute decision in an email exchange with Kyle Buchanan, also writing for Vulture, quote, "I think, unfortunately, it's pretty normal in terms of my not quite painless for everyone involved process of discovering what the movie is. Samantha was with us on set and was amazing. It was only in post-production when we started editing that we realized what the character movie needed was different from what Samantha and I had created together. So we recast, and since then, Scarlett has taken over that role," end quote. The movie was hailed as one of the best of 2013 and would win Jonze an Academy Award for Best Original Screenplay. Morton would get an associate producer credit on the movie. The story of how Shrek was saved is pretty short, and unfortunately, it's also the most tragic of these. The movie was inspired by a book from 1990, Shrek, by William Steig, who had spent 3 decades drawing comics for The New Yorker. Steven Spielberg initially brought the rights to the film in 1991 and wanted to make a 2D film. From that point on, it would be a long, 10-year road to the big screen, during which the film cycled through a number of ideas and tests on what Shrek would look like and what the story would be. When he was cast, Chris Farley was at the height of his career. He had a successful stint on SNL and was making the jump to comedy movies, including Tommy Boy and Beverly Hills Ninja. While known for his comedy, and while Shrek is ostensibly a comedic movie, Farley's voiceover was a lot different from what eventual voice actor Mike Myers would do. Farley voiced him without the accent and as a much more insecure character who just wanted to be loved and accepted for who he was and not how he looked.
Yes, someone hurt you so bad. Someone hurt you many years ago.
Leave my parents out of this!
Breakthrough!
For screenwriter Terry Rossio, the Shrek that Farley voiced reminded him of Farley. In his words, quote, What struck me the most seeing Farley work was his willingness to reveal himself, lay himself out bare over and over again for the sake of his performance, end quote. When he died, Farley had reportedly voiced 85% of the character's lines. By some estimates, he only had 5 days of recording left to do. Alas, it was not to be. Farley died of an overdose on December 18, 1997 at just 33. DreamWorks asked his younger brother, John, to read the lines, but reasonably, the hurt was too near and he declined. Eventually, Mike Myers agreed to replace Chris Farley. But Myers didn't just want to be seen as his replacement. He requested that they rewrite the entire script so he could provide a completely fresh version. Myers recorded his lines, but after seeing a rough cut, decided to re-record them with a Scottish accent. That extra time recording helped him zero in on the character we finally saw after nearly 10 years of work. Now, it's one thing to come in the clutch to save a voice role. It's important to be sure, but voice roles are also a bit more relaxed and can be done from almost anywhere. But it's another thing entirely to reshoot a complete character and do it so well that you earn a nomination for Best Supporting Actor at the Academy Awards. It's to Ridley Scott and Christopher Plummer's credit that they pulled off such a feat with all the money in the world. Now, Ridley Scott is a hell of a director. In a town where a movie can take anywhere from 1.5 years to decades to make, Scott somehow managed to direct, finish post-production on, and release all the money in the world in a single calendar year. Scott was finalizing plans to direct the movie in March of 2017. He had begun production by May of 2017 and finished shooting by August of 2017. They had set the release date for December 8, 2017. The movie, which is about the 1973 kidnapping of John Paul Getty III, originally starred Kevin Spacey as oil magnate J. Paul Getty. But in October of that year, Spacey was accused of sexual misconduct. Ridley Scott decided that he wasn't going to let one man ruin all the work that he had put into this. So he decided to recast Spacey entirely with the eminent Christopher Plummer. Now, at this point, the movie was complete and was ready to release soon. Deadline reported on November 8th that Scott and the studio, quote, decided to remove Kevin Spacey from their finished movie, All the Money in the World. Christopher Plummer has been set to replace Spacey in the role of J. Paul Getty. Reshoots of the key scenes are expected to commence immediately, end quote. The reshoots lasted from November 20th until November 29th and came with a cost of $10 million, which increased the $40 million budget to $50 million. Amazingly, the premiere was pushed out by just 10 days, from December 8th to December 18th. All the Money in the World is a great movie on its own, saved by two men in their 80s, Plummer, who was 88 and definitely earned his Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actor, and Ridley Scott, who was 80 and still works like a man possessed. Matt Zoller Seitz noted this in his 3 out of 4 star review for RogerEbert.com that, quote, the film is a testament to the awesome work ethic of its 80-year-old but still apparently tireless director, end quote. And of Plummer, he wrote, quote, in fact, I wouldn't be surprised if Plummer got another Oscar for this part. If he does, it shouldn't be seen merely as an acknowledgement of good work under weird and unfortunate circumstances, but as a recognition of how precise and fearless he is, end quote. He was right on both counts. It's pretty difficult for me to think of Wolverine as anyone other than Hugh Jackman, but it almost happened. Before Jackman was ever cast, the role had already gone to Scottish actor Dougray Scott. Scott had begun acting in the 90s and had a critically and commercially successful movie, Ever After, in 1998. Tom Cruise had chosen him to play the villain in Mission Impossible 2, while Fox wanted him as their Wolverine. Scott wasn't the first choice. That was Russell Crowe, who Bryan Singer wanted, but Crowe declined and turned them on to Hugh Jackman, though they decided to go with Scott instead. The issue, however, was Mission Impossible 2. Fox was aware of the production and had negotiated Scott's contract to account for it. Production on X-Men would start in September 1999, but Scott could arrive as late as October 18th. Unfortunately, Mission Impossible 2 was running into issues that extended the production time. It was difficult for them to pin down a script, and key crew members like production designer Owen Patterson, production manager Julia Ritchie, and director of photography Andrew Lesnie would all leave the project, leaving them scrambling for replacements. To compound that, Scott would suffer a motorcycle accident during production. It was basically a perfect storm that all but ensured that Scott wouldn't be able to start filming on October 18, 1999, as originally desired. On October 11th, when Variety reported that Hugh Jackman would replace Scott, they noted the last-minute nature of it all. Quote, even though X-Men had begun production late last month, Fox was holding out hope until the last minute that Paramount would be able to give a stop date for Scott on Mission so he could join the cast in Toronto this week. In the whirlwind casting change, Jackman's deal was finalized late last week so he could be fitted for his claws over the weekend. He would begin rehearsals and action choreography today, end quote. At that point, Jackman was relatively unknown outside of Australia. He had done several TV shows and was in 2 movies, Erskineville Kings and Paperback Hero, both released in 1999. Wolverine would be his 3rd film role and arguably the most important, as well as the one that he's most identified with. He's played the character for 24 years now, and he manages to hit it out of the park pretty much all of the time. Dougray Scott, for his part, was understanding about the situation. In his words, quote, "I like Hugh. He's a really lovely guy. It wasn't as if he stole it off me. Basically, my movie ran over and I had to pull out. It wasn't his fault and he did a fantastic job," end quote. When a star is as entwined in a role as Harrison Ford is with Indiana Jones, it's sometimes impossible to consider how things could have been different. But if not for a wicked stroke of luck, it very well might have been. George Lucas pitched Steven Spielberg on the character when they were vacationing in Hawaii to help Lucas avoid Star Wars reviews because he thought that it would bomb. Spielberg wanted to do a James Bond movie, but had no luck with the Broccoli family, which owned the film rights to James Bond. So instead, they conceived a character that had a Bondian tilt to him. But casting such a character, they found, would be a pain. They also had somewhat divergent ideas of who to go with. Spielberg supported casting Harrison Ford from the beginning, but Lucas was against it for a few reasons. One, he had already done American Graffiti, Star Wars, and Empire Strikes Back with Ford. He didn't want to become associated with Ford like Martin Scorsese had been with Robert De Niro. Second, he wasn't sure that Ford would agree to do a 3-movie deal, which is what they had with Paramount, who was fronting the cash. And third, he wanted someone lesser known than Ford, who starred in literally the most successful movie in the world at the time. A number of actors were considered: Bill Murray, Jeff Bridges, Sam Elliott, David Hasselhoff, Tom Selleck, and more. They ultimately decided to proceed with Tom Selleck but ran into a problem. At that point, Selleck had done a pilot for Magnum P.I. and was under contract at CBS to make the show if they decided to put it into production. Maybe naively, Spielberg and Lucas asked CBS to release Selleck from his contract 10 days early so that he could do Raiders of the Lost Ark. Well, what CBS saw was that 2 of America's most successful directors, the man who made Jaws and the man who made Star Wars, were after one of their would-be stars. Instead of releasing Selleck from his contract, they decided to greenlight Magnum P.I., obligating Selleck to star in the show or else. Filming was only a few weeks off, so they had to make a choice. Wait, which they couldn't do because they were locked in, or find someone else. So they approached Harrison Ford, who readily agreed, even to the 3-picture deal, and thus a legend was born. In an ironic twist, there was an actor strike which meant that Magnum P.I. was on the back burner for months. Because Raiders of the Lost Ark was filmed in England, Selleck actually could have done the role if CBS wasn't so stingy. Alas, it was not to be. When we think of actor, we think of the person we physically see for a good reason. But voice acting is no less of an art form than acting itself. For evidence, we need to look no further than Darth Vader, one of the greatest villains ever created. Man, I think there's an argument to be made for him being the greatest villain, bar none. The American Film Institute has him at number 3, just behind Anthony Hopkins, Hannibal Lecter from Silence of the Lambs, and Anthony Perkins, Norman Bates from Psycho, which, yeah, that makes sense. Meanwhile, Empire magazine has him at number 1, ahead of Heath Ledger's Joker, which, yeah, I would agree with, but they also have Tom Hiddleston's Loki and Alan Rickman's Hans Gruber ahead of Hopkins' Lecter, which I think makes exactly 0 sense whatsoever, so take that one with a grain of salt. All of that is to say, though, that Darth Vader is an excellent villain. But Vader consists of multitudes. First, there's the look. Vader is an imposing figure. There's the iconic helmet and the all-black suit, sure, but there's also the height. That's to the credit of the man who wore the suit most of the time, David Prowse, an English bodybuilder, weightlifter, and strongman, as well as an actor. When Prowse accepted the role of Vader, he figured that he would be doing the acting and the voice. The voice, of course, is the second aspect of Vader that's just as important as the look. Vader has a deep and menacing voice that radiated power and intensity, while Vader's breathing is pretty iconic and was one of the many miracles worked by sound designer Ben Burtt. It's the voice that helps seal the deal of making Vader sound as menacing as he looks. But whether he had decided when he cast him or later, Lucas eventually decided that David Prowse's voice was not right for the role. Prowse had a West Country accent that did not really jibe with the look of Vader. For example, this is what David Prowse sounded like.
You are part of the Rebel Alliance and a traitor. Take her away.
And this is what James Earl Jones, who would eventually voice Vader, sounded like.
You are part of the Rebel Alliance and a traitor. Take her away!
Out of respect for David Prowse, James Earl Jones asked Lucas not to be credited on Star Wars or Empire Strikes Back. He didn't even put in a full day's work. He was paid $7,000 for 3 hours of work on the first movie, which, all in all, isn't that bad. Prowse, of course, was not happy with the recasting, but it was, I think, the right move. Casting is an art, not a science, but either way, you're prone to making mistakes or having external forces intervene in what might otherwise have seemed like a perfect choice. But in virtually all of these cases, I can't imagine anyone else in the role. James Earl Jones' voice just matches what I imagine Darth Vader to sound like. I don't see how anyone but Viggo Mortensen could have played Aragorn, despite the differences between the book and the movies. Harrison Ford is irreplaceable as Indiana Jones, and the same goes for Eddie Murphy as Axel Foley. Most of this is probably just bias. Perhaps if someone else played the role and I viewed it with fresh eyes, I might feel differently. And just as well though, it could be the case that these last-minute decisions really did save these movies.